Thanks so much for having me. As B said, I'm Andrea Valdez. I do have a background in Texas Texas media, and a little bit of Texas politics, covering that in the media. But mostly now I work at the 19th News. I'm excited to share a little bit with you about what it is that we're doing now, and kind of my thoughts on Texas women, politics and policy. So with that, let me make sure that I have this. Okay, and hopefully everybody can hear my sound. If you can't, then just let me know in the chat. All right, here we go.
Today, women make up more than half of the American electorate and are more engaged than ever in our politics. Yet we remain marginalized in government and elective office.
It's important for women to have a voice in this democracy because we see women being disproportionately affected across our society in so many areas.
The reality is the news industry is already gendered. The 19th is working to level the playing field.
Our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment, but with an asterisk, the recognition of the omission of certain women from the franchise, from access to the ballot.
We are firm believers that all issues are women's issues. Our readers are people who care about those issues, who care deeply about the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, and want a more nuanced approach to that politics and policy journalism.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th.
With live events and interviews, the 19th is fostering civil conversations and community building that brings our readers into direct contact with the people who represent them.
There's never been a Black woman governor in American history.
I think that our newsroom being as diverse as it is, it means that we're looking and telling stories of women that maybe had not been previously represented in media before.
Our goal is to launch the first newsroom that is truly reflective of the nation's women.
There's more women running now than ever have been before, and people want to be informed.
Because what we know is that women are eager to have conversations about politics and often do not feel like they have a safe space to do that. We want to create that community for women, and we want to create that community for women everywhere.
Newsrooms need to be more inclusive. They need to better reflect their communities. The 19th has the opportunity to do that from the ground floor, and we're not wasting that opportunity.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
All right. It gets me every time. Let's see. Hopefully everybody was able to hear that. And so now I wanted to share with you just a little bit about us. I have a presentation queued up. So again, thank you so much for, make sure I can have my chat open too. I want to be able to see if you guys have questions. Okay, let's see. Let me start this. Sorry, this is, as you know, the brave new world we all live in these days. Okay, so thank you again for having me. Really excited to be here and share with you a little bit about the 19th and talk with you all about such an important topic. So I'll tell you a little bit about who we are, and then I'll talk about the power of ideas, the power of action, the power of community, and then I hope we can leave a little bit of time for questions. So what is the 19th? Hopefully the video that I just showed gives you a sense of who we are and what it is that we're doing. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more granularly about what our mission is, what our broader vision is for how it is that we cover things through the 19th lens. So a little bit about us. The 19th is a nonprofit, nonpartisan news platform that covers the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. And as you probably gathered, our namesake is the 19th Amendment, which I wanted to tell you all a little bit about the 19th Amendment. I'm sure most people here know about it, but just a century ago, in August, we had the 100th anniversary, the centennial anniversary last August 2020, of the 19th Amendment, which was an amendment to the US Constitution that made voting our country's most fundamental mode of civic participation a right, regardless of your gender. But if you know a little bit about the history of the 19th Amendment, then you know that this watershed moment in our democracy excluded millions of women, including women of color, and that was excluded from the ballot box for generations, really until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So the reality is that suffrage remains a work in progress for many in this country, particularly women living in states where voter suppression exists and where there's tens of thousands of transgender Americans who still face barriers to voting. So the reason that we launched is we recognize that today women make up more than half of the electorate and are more engaged than ever in our politics. Women are marching on state capitals, they're voting at higher rates than men, they're running for local office, they're seeking the presidency in record numbers if 2020's Democratic primary election tells us anything. And still, despite all of this, they remain underrepresented in government and in the nation's executive ranks. Women are frankly underrepresented in politics and policy journalism and in newsroom leadership. And this is important because that's what influences what stories are told, how the news is covered, and whose voices are elevated. So, as I said, women are underrepresented in politics. I thought I would just share a little bit of the statistics that really bring home just how stark this is. 73.7 million women voted in 2016. We don't have full numbers for 2020 just yet. So that's nearly 10 million more than men. And still, 26.5% of the seats held in Congress are held by women. So even though we make up more than half of the electorate, we still only make up roughly 1/4 of the seats held in Congress. The good news on that front is that we're up from 23% in 2018. So those numbers are ticking up. There are 24 women serving in the Senate, 118 women serving in the House. And that is a number that's increased for both Democrats and Republicans over the last midterm election. So that's something I think to celebrate. I wanted to talk also about the number of women of color that are in office. So 7.5% of the total state legislators in the country, that's more than 7,000 seats, are women of color. Now, of the women in Congress, 35.9% are women of color. And that is, I think, also something to celebrate. We're seeing more women run in Congress than ever before, as I noted just a moment ago. And women of color are particularly seeking that office, which I think is something that reflects that there is a real desire to be involved in politics today. And I think that's something that's worth noting, to kind of, regardless of what your politics are, is that Kamala Harris is now the first woman and the first Black and South Asian person to be the Vice President of the United States. And that is a huge barrier that has been broken. And I think, again, regardless of how you feel about Democrats or Republicans, I think that's something worth noting. So as I said, the 19th Amendment remains unfinished business. So we have an asterisk in our logo, which I'm sure you've seen. And that is, as Aaron said in the video a moment ago, it's supposed to remind us of the women and of the people who have been omitted from democracy still. And the expansion of the franchise continues today. And so, as I said, at the 19th, our goal is to empower those that we serve, particularly women, people of color, anyone who's been marginalized based on their gender or race, with the information, resources, and community they need to be equal participants in society. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the asterisk. This is something that I get a lot of questions about, and I think that it's worth diving into what exactly that means. So, So I'm sure many of you have heard of Brianna Taylor. So Brianna Taylor last year was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, and it became a flashpoint in the, summer of unrest that we saw in 2020. Before you knew her name, before the Say Her Name hashtag really kind of took off across Twitter, and people were talking about Brianna Taylor and her story, and she became I think a real rallying cry for people who were upset about racial injustice in America. This story was reported, and I want to give kudos to the local reporters who had done some reporting on Brianna Taylor's story, but was largely unknown to most of America. And what happened is, I want to tell you a little bit about how we came to report on that story. We actually had one of the, if not the first big national story on Brianna Taylor's case. And that's because our editor at large, Erin Haynes, she came to me and she said, I want to write about this case out of Louisville. I think it's really important. I think that we need to write about it. And I said, well, tell me about why we should write about this. Aside from the fact that Brianna Taylor is a woman, and we write about women, obviously, women's issues, or all issues are women's issues, but we write about women's issues specifically. And Erin said, we don't talk about police brutality against women the same way we do against men. And that really it struck me. And it was something that, I told her, okay, go report this out, come back and let's talk about it. And she went and she talked to the lawyer for Brianna Taylor, who said this quote right here: while many of the headlines and hashtags are often for men, the primary victims of such shootings, Black women are also impacted. And so I think that really underscored for us what the asterisk is, which is looking for just kind of a deeper, more nuanced look at the news and thinking about that from, again, a lens of gender through politics and policy. So that's a little bit about who we are and kind of how it is that we determine what stories we think fit the 19th. So that I wanted to actually stop and do a little bit of trivia, just to kind of get people engaged and, hopefully for everyone to feel as though, they can, flex some of their own knowledge here. I thought I would ask if you have your answers, go ahead and put it in the chat. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, what did Alice Paul, who was one of the suffragettes, turn her attention to? Was it passing the Equal Rights Amendment? Was it campaigning for an all-woman Supreme Court, building a women's housing rights organization, or rewriting the national anthem? I'll give a couple minutes or a few seconds, see if people have some thoughts here. And just also, I did look, Alice Paul was a Quaker and was very involved in her faith and brought her faith with her to a lot of her beliefs and, her passion for equal rights and suffrage. All right, we're seeing some A's, some B's. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and reveal it was passing an Equal Rights Amendment. And I think it's worth noting that, all that time ago, the Equal Rights Amendment has still not been ratified. I'm sure that some of y'all know that is something that is still seeking ratification. It requires, oh my goodness, I'm terrible at this. It requires that 35 states, it requires that 38 states ratify it in order to become an amendment. And we're just still not there yet. So I thought that was a pretty interesting piece of trivia that I thought I would share with y'all today. So I wanted to talk about the power of ideas. So here at the 19th, obviously through media, the power of ideas is what powers our newsroom, and it's what powers what decisions we make every day as to what it is that we're covering, how we're covering it. And I want to talk about, 4 huge ideas that I think power America, and they're ones that I think about a lot. So liberty, obviously, equality, which is something that, again, is hugely front of mind for us at the 19th, thinking about equity. Democracy, which it seems Josh talked about so eloquently and so passionately about, as far as engaging in our democracy, upholding our democracy, believing in democracy, being empowered to participate in democracy. And then civic responsibility, which to me, that means making sure that we are taking care of our fellow Americans, that we are acting in ways that are uplifting, our neighbors and our community. And so, the power of ideas, it's been something that is, again, what America is built on. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we at the 19th have really been consumed with over the past year. And I should say, actually, the 19th has been around for roughly a year now. We had our soft launch in January 27th. So this will be our 1-year anniversary. But we have been publishing on our site, 19thnews.org, since August. Again, we wanted to coincide with the centennial anniversary of suffrage. And so for the past year, these are kind of some of the ideas that have been galvanizing us. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and probably all of these are things that you all have either dealt with or have thinking about, but equal pay for equal work. I think that's something that, has been a rallying cry and something that people have been talking about, the gender pay gap for, a generation, if not more. But we have seen that despite a lot of inroads being made around equal pay for equal work, in 2020, the gender pay gap was still 82 cents for every male dollar earned for white women. Now, if you get even more granular and you look at women of color, it's an even wider gap. That's 54 cents that Latinas make for every white male dollar. For Black women, it's 62 cents. And for Native American, it's 57 cents. Economics are something that we have been thinking about so deeply because this last year we saw what has been called this she-cession. Even though I'm not a giant fan of that term, I think it gets across what has happened this past year. So 2020, as everyone knows, when the pandemic hit, the economic fallout has been, gigantic, and it has been ongoing. And it has been disproportionately something that has impacted women. It's the first time that women lost more jobs than men in a recession ever. There have been other recessions, of course, but most of the time men lose more jobs than women. But this was the first time that was reversed. And in fact, women's unemployment reached double digits for the first time since 1948, which was when the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking that number. And then I think it's worth noting that, again, when you get a little more granular and you look at, who is being impacted, it's really women of color have been impacted most deeply. At its worst, Latinas had 20% unemployment, and they still have the highest unemployment rate of any group at 9.1%. And that there was double-digit unemployment for Latinas, for Black women, and I believe for Native women too. So it's something that we're crawling back from, and I am hopeful that there will be some additional. There's been a stimulus and there's been money put back into the economy to help small business owners and help women get back on their feet, or programs that have disproportionately helped women get back on their feet. And I think that there is a lot more for us to cover in that realm. Now, who here has heard of the sandwich generation? That's kind of a new term to me, but something that I have, now that I've heard it, I feel as though I know so many who are dealing with it. But the sandwich generation is the generation of, oftentimes women, but people who are dealing with either young kids or grandkids and taking care of their parents. And I'd say that the sandwich generation has also been something that it's been a generation that's really been impacted by this pandemic. So roughly 700,000 parents with young kids left the workforce in 2020. And for many, they really pointed the finger at childcare, not having childcare. Yes, if anyone has been, part of the sandwich generation, I'm sure you feel this so acutely right now. And so yeah, childcare has been something that has really gone away. There's a large number of childcare centers have had to shutter because they weren't getting enough funding, or they didn't have enough people coming because of the pandemic, and people were scared of safety issues. And so consequently, childcare centers, which have already operated on these historically thin profit margins, either closed their doors completely, or they have been, something that have really suffered. And I think it's worth noting that in childcare, that's, I think, roughly 80% of childcare workers are women. So it's not only women and mothers who are having to take their kids to childcare who can no longer do so out of safety concerns, but a lot of women who are employed in that industry who are out of a job right now. And then that goes the other way as well. Roughly 42 million Americans, or roughly 16% of all adults, serve as a caregiver for a relative that's 50 years or older. And the majority of the women, or the people who are doing this work, are women. On average, they're just shy of 50 themselves. So again, I think this is something that is, it's an ongoing issue. It will be an issue before the pandemic, obviously, after the pandemic, but it is very much exacerbated by the moment that we're living in right now. And then, of course, healthcare. Healthcare is cited as, one of the most important issues for every voter. I think roughly the Pew Reports Research Center found that roughly 70% of people say it's the number one issue that they take with them to the ballot box. And the CDC has shown that while women are somewhat less likely to be uninsured than men, those who don't have insurance, what they cite is that it's an unaffordable for them to actually get it. That's the reason they don't have it. So expanding access to health insurance and introducing some generous subsidies could help alleviate that issue, experts believe. So healthcare is a huge issue. It has so many different tentacles to it, and it's something that we have been covering very closely at the 19th. And if you want to see more stories that we're writing about this, you can go to 19thnews.org. So as far as ideas, I really did love this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was talking about the power of ideas. One thing I believe profoundly, oops, oh my God, I'm so sorry. One thing I believe profoundly, we make our own history. The course of history is directed by the choices we make, and our choices grow out of the ideas, the beliefs, the values, the dreams of the people. And the reason that I liked this is that I thought that it really, again, it really shows where do these ideas come from? You know, I talked about some of these big, huge ideas: liberty, democracy, equality, civic responsibility. But ideas do come from somewhere. And I think that for the purposes of this particular conference, I think a lot of it is that it comes through faith. I actually wanted to see, you know, how much is faith a running through line in our politicians' lives. And I saw that actually Pew did some research recently on the 117th Congress and found that, let's see, I had the numbers written down here. The 117th Congress, the most recent one that has been just sworn in this past couple weeks ago, that largely most of them are still affiliated with a faith. 88% of legislators identify as a Christian. And I thought it was interesting that if you got more granular and you broke it down by party, that 78% of Democrats in Congress identify as Christian, and 99% of Republicans in Congress identify as Christian. And I think it's worth noting also that a big part of the inauguration that we saw this last week was a conversation around Joe Biden being a Catholic. And it's something that I believe he is, you know, talked about his faith. He's brought his faith with him to his campaign. And we saw that, I think, on full display at the inauguration with a number of faith leaders that were invited to speak and pray at the inauguration. And I thought that was interesting, at least for these purposes. All right, so I thought I'd take us into a little more trivia. This one about Ida B. Wells, which I'm sure many of you have heard of her. So in 1913, Ida B. Wells defied orders from organizers at the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. by doing what? Was she wearing pants, blocking a busy street, refusing to stand back, or reporting on the parade? I'll give a few seconds for people to drop some thoughts in the chat. Seeing a lot of C. Yep, a lot of C. All right, y'all know your stuff. It's C. It's refusing to stand in the back. So Ida B. Wells, after being invited to the march in 1913, the suffrage parade in DC, white organizers asked Ida B. Wells and other women of color to stand at the back of the line, or back of the parade. She refused and waited at the parade sidelines to join at the front of the Illinois white suffragist delegation. And this is, I want to talk about the power of action. So Ida B. Wells took action, didn't she? And I think the way that we see action reflected oftentimes is through legislation. So to go back to some of those, you know, big ideas that I had mentioned a moment ago, you know, liberty, I think freedom of speech, you know, we see that reflected as a foundational right in our Constitution. Equality, the Equal Rights Amendment, the struggle for which continues today. For democracy, I think suffrage, obviously, and the Voting Rights Act. As I said, you know, many women were denied access to the ballot box really up until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And then civic responsibility. I think we see a lot of that going on today, but I think as a Texan, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the Great Society and what the Johnson administration did to really, you know, legislate and codify civic responsibility and taking care of people in our community and in our country through much of the legislation that was passed under the Great Society programs. And then one more trivia, I promise this is the last one, but these were really fun and I wanted to share them with y'all. Which president's legacy did suffragist Rose Schneiderman influence? Was it Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson? I'll give you all a couple of seconds to put in some answers here. Got a D, Woodrow Wilson. All right, this one was a little tricky because it's actually FDR. Rose Schneiderman became friends with Eleanor Roosevelt through the ACLU, and upon her death, the New York Times credited her with teaching the Roosevelts most of what they knew about unions. And this is what I wanted to come to, which is talking about the power of community and networks. And I wanted to point to some of our coverage on what I think the power of community can do, and what we at the 19th have been reporting on with regards to specific women and their particular networks. So I wanted to point out, obviously, I think there was a lot of attention on Get Out the Vote, and I'm gonna pull out Stacey Abrams as an example here, but I'm sure that people who have been doing Get Out the Vote efforts. There have been Get Out the Vote efforts across the country. In 2018, we saw that was a huge reason, a huge driver for more women, or the Year of the Woman in 2018. And in 2020, we saw more people vote than have ever voted before. And I think that was largely due to so many really impressive Get Out the Vote efforts. But the reason that I pulled out Stacey Abrams is I think that she had a very impressive story in Georgia. One of her projects that she started actually in 2014, she's also the founder of Fair Fight, which has done a lot to help with voting suppression or voter suppression. But one of her projects from 2014 called the New American Majority identified that young people of color, and unmarried women were an untapped constituency. And since then, New American Majority has registered 500,000 Georgians to vote, according to a spokesman that was speaking to Reuters. And the reason that I point this out is because, runoff elections, special elections, I'm sure you all know, are notorious for low voter turnout. But if we look at the runoff election that we saw in Georgia, that it's hard to believe, but was just earlier this year, it was on January 5th, huge voter turnout. And I think that's the power of people understanding that they should register, that they need to go out, that they can vote, that they have a civic responsibility, civic duty to exercise their right to vote. And Stacey Abrams really tapped into that in Georgia. Now, she would, of course, say, and I'm sure I would agree, that it wasn't just her, that there was a whole network of grassroots organizers that helped her do that actual work. But she, was, I think, a really, big figure at the forefront of all of that. And then there's community outreach. Now, Getting Out the Vote efforts are a part of community outreach, but I also wanted to call out this impressive young woman out in Arizona. Her name is Gabriela Casares Kelly, and she's the member of the Tohono O'odham Nation in Pima County. And she ran for Pima County Recorder this year after she realized that it was very difficult for people in her community to vote. So basically, her community, the county where she lives, is roughly the size of Connecticut. And there was one place for people in her community to vote. And a lot of people in her community, they don't have access to transportation, they don't have access to a car, they don't have access to a bus or any sort of public transportation that could get them there. And so it was really difficult for them to get out to vote. And this voting location was under threat of being closed down. So when she saw all of this, she went out in her community and she tried to demystify the process, really. And she noted that after she really went out and explained to people how it is that they can get out into the community, when she helped them understand what it means to register, the importance of voting, that there was a dramatic change in voting culture on the reservation where her community is. And I just thought that was a really astounding story, that someone recognizes that there's a real difficulty to actually go out and exercise your right to vote. And in fact, she won her election for Pima County Recorder. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is being in the room where it happens. This was obviously the title of a pretty famous book this past year, but if you are a Hamilton fan, then you also recognize it from the lyrics of that musical. But I do think that there's power in being in the room where it happens. If you have a voice and you have a voice where you can use it when it counts, then there's going to be a trickle-down effect. So Janet Yellen, who is currently going through confirmation hearings right now, if she's confirmed, she'll be the first woman to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And as part of her confirmation hearings, it became clear when she was talking and being asked questions, that one of her primary concerns and priorities was going to be making sure that women and women of color were going to have access to some of the programs that could help them get back on their feet. As I said, they were the ones that have been most impacted by some of this, the She session. And she had a really great quote, which I thought was interesting, is economics is sometimes considered a dry subject, but I've always tried to approach my science. And she was actually referencing her father, who was a doctor, and the way that he did, which was as a means to help people. And I think that it's important to be in the room where it happens, because as you know, and I can speak from my own experience, being in the room where it happens, you get to kind of set the agenda, right? And I think that I had read, it's not enough to be at the table, you have to set the menu. And I really like that quote too, because I think that really shows that if you're not there, then you don't have a voice and you can't represent people that you might have a voice for. So from my own personal experience, I will say that roughly 75% of editors of American newspapers are white men. I am a Latina woman, and I think that being in the room where I'm making decisions about what's being covered, who we're covering, what goes, at the top of our homepage, those are decisions that I think, are not any more or less important than the decisions they're making, but they could be different decisions, and they could be, putting someone on the forefront that might not have been if they were making those same, or if they were presented with those same decisions. And so that's something that I think about as a newspaper or as an editor a lot. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is, again, we've really seen a historic moment with Kamala Harris being elected Vice President of the United States. We saw a lot of firsts this year. It's going to be the most diverse cabinet that has ever been put into place if all of the Biden-Harris administration's nominations end up being confirmed. We're seeing, some of, even on the state level, we're seeing, I think the first Black and woman mayor of Boston was elected earlier this year. So we're seeing a lot of firsts happen right now. But I believe it was Kamala Harris's mother who had told her, I saw that Doug Emhoff, her husband, quoted his mother-in-law saying, "You may be the first, don't be the last." And I think that that's worth keeping in mind, that if you are the first of anything, it puts a lot of pressure on you. But what the pressure that I think it puts on you the most is to make sure that you are creating a space where people see you, and then they feel that they are, their own community, their own experience is reflected, and that they can rise to the place where you are. And so what I pulled out to reflect this is, at the inauguration, the woman who recited the pledge was the first Georgia chief firefighter I can't remember where in Georgia she is. That's terrible. In any case, she was a first. And so she was reciting the pledge, and we actually spoke with her, and she had, I thought, a really good take on what it means to be first. And she said, being the first, there's a lot of pageantry around it when it's first announced. However, you're becoming the torchbearer for everybody that's coming behind you. You become the example for good or bad. Being the first, you know that a lot is riding on your ability to be successful in that role. And I think that that's a responsibility that if you're the first to do anything, that you should take that responsibility seriously. And I want to talk a little bit about, for us, how we are tapping into our network at the 19th. So the 19th News, one of our, core mission or core tenets, one of our core priorities is to have our stories be free to read and free to republish. So what that means is we'll never have a paywall. People will always be able to read it. And I believe that's so important, because as we are seeing more paywalls, more things you have to subscribe to, I'm sure you're feeling subscriber fatigue. I know I am. That I think that being able to have information that's free to read is really important for the people who can't pay for really good quality information and still deserve access to it, and still deserve the, the freedom to be informed. And so free to read is certainly a huge part of our priorities. The other thing is free to republish, which means, I'm so sorry, there's sirens. Free to republish means that, basically every other website, if they wanted to take our story and republish it to theirs, they're allowed to. So right now, our story has been republished across the USA Today network's 262 markets. And we've had our stories translated into Spanish for Univision. And then we have had our stories picked up by Glamour, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, all over the place. And for us, I think that means that we're hoping to tap into our network so that people whether or not they know that they've read a 19th story, that they have access to that information and they can read those stories and see themselves reflected in coverage. And so if you are a woman in El Paso who picks up the El Paso Times, we really want to make sure that if you have a 19th story in front of you, it doesn't matter to us if you know it's the 19th or not. We just want you to know that you're reflected in that coverage. And so for us, we've been tapping into, again, the power of our network to have as much reach as possible.